Good evening. I tell you some interesting story.
Sorry, I had my volume turned down. I didn't know you came in. Hi, Rabbi.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to a new chapter. So it says over here, אין עושים פתילות לנר של שבת בין נר שעל השולחן, בין כל נר שמדליק בבית בית. כל דבר שאור, right, מסכסך בו. Right, so this is like a famous topic matter which we read every Erev Shabbat in the shul. It's called Bamim Madlikin. It's a special parak there, special chapter in Masechet Shabbat regarding what kind of oil and what kind of wicks we can use for the Shabbat candles. So it starts off right away telling you don't use a kind of a wick which makes the flame jump around. You know, it's not like it's not stable. The flame. פירוש שאינו נאחז אלא נסחח סביבה בשלהבת קופצת ודולגת. That's exactly what I just told you. The Elohen, right? So he says these are the ones that jump around like that, not stable. So he says, right, lechesh. The who mean erez, so it's a type of a cedar, right? Ukimo tzimmer giffen. So he says it's like similar to cotton. Gadel ben ha'etz ben klipa. It grows between the tree and the what do they call that? The bark, right? The outer layer, whatever that's called. It grows in between those two things, right? There's something that grows there. Upishtan, chosen veupishtan. So then you have flax, right? Also, not good. It's not good for a wick. Shalona futs. But we're talking about if it wasn't parted. the flax. It's unprocessed. Kelech. Then we have another one. Pehu pesolet shel meshi. So it says this is the the byproduct of the silk. Waste product. Idan. So what's idan? The who mean arava, type of myrtle. I'm sorry, not myrtle, willow. Type of willow. ויש כמו צמר גפן בין קליפה לעץ פתילת המדבר. So he says there's also another type of thing that grows in the tree, like we described before, between the wood and the bark. But it grows in a desert. The whole mean Shulchan Aruch, it's like a long type of grass, he says. So let me just make sure I said this right. Just to repeat the last sentence, right? We said ויש כמו צמר גפן בין קליפה לעץ פתילת המדבר והוא מין עשב. Right. So let me read it again, right? It says, let me translate it again. He's talking about, it resembles, right, that what you find in the tree, between the wood and the tree and the bark. And it's a type of grass which is long. I didn't read this right. I'm just going to read it again more time. Okay. Sorry about that. So it says, so we said, right, the last thing we said before we got into the mistake was there's the waste product that comes from the silk, byproduct, whatever you want to call it. And then, right, we have idan. So this is the myrtle, right, as we said. It looks like it did read it right. Whatever. Okay, whatever. Doesn't matter. Just making sure. So then he says, right, we have the grass, which is long. Second, I'm sorry. Okay, so right, so you have this which resembles that, that thing that we found in the tree, as we said, but it's like a long grass, okay, which is in the okay, yeah, now I got it right. Yeah, I was not reading it right. I'm sorry. No, better late than never. So it's like this, right? We said we have the byproduct which comes from the silk, and then we said idan, right? So idan is a type of willow. That's that. And then he says there's another type which is called idan, all right, which is resembles that we found what we found in the tree, as we said before. So that's that. Then we have another type which is called petilat midbar. Right? We have So what is this? Vehu min eseb aroch. It's a long grass. Umoch shebetocho rawi ladlik bo. So you have inside, right, some kind of a spongy substance, right? What you can use as a wick. Biroka shel pnei hamayim, and then you have this green stuff which grows on the water. Vehu yarok shegadel saviv hasfina. So he says this is like the green stuff that grows around the ship, right? You know, that green stuff, the algae, whatever they call it, right? That stuff, you know. When it stands, you know, docked in like a certain port, so it grows over there. Echad al panei hamayim grows on the water. Velo betzemer, also don't use wool, he says. So wool is not a good wick. It also jumps around. And then he says, by the way, the ones that we use today, what are they made of? The wicks. They're probably either cotton or that hard stuff. What do they call that? That comes from the flax, you know, linen, right? Linen, something like that, right? Flax. I think that's what they're made of today. And they're good. They don't jump around. Okay, whatever. We're gonna get into that, right? I'm just starting out. So so you have that algae that grows around the ship, right? Whatever, something like that. Also, we said the wool, right? Wool is not good. But lo basar, also don't use hair, right? Don't hair jumps around. Okay. Okay, great. So what else we got here? Here's Rashi. Rashi explains, Shen Madlikin the cannabis, right? So he says, don't use cannabis, which is like, you know, canvas, what we call canvas. Same thing. Not a good wick. Velo bersemer gefen. He says also, don't use cotton. Rabbeinu Tam hitiro, right? So he says Rabbeinu Tam allows cotton. V'nahagu kemoto. He says the custom is like that, you know, to allow cotton. Bekak katav Tosfot. Tosfot also says this. Ve'im karach davar asher madlikin bo al davar she'en madlikin bo. So okay, that's really, maybe it's already something else. Let's go to Bet Yosef. Okay, so I think we finally got it straight, more or less. So says Bet Yosef, regarding this, he brings a source, right? Kulam mehem the Mishnah, as we said, right? It's in the Mishnah, Kaf Amud Bet, right? Bameh Madlikin. This is the one that we read Erev Shabbat in the shul. Right? Then we said, right, we don't use wool, we don't use hair. Sham bebraita, it's in the Braita, it says, V'katava Rashbam, says Rashba in the Tshuva, she'amadlik b'Shabbat b'shmanim. He lights on Shabbat, right, with types of oils, upatilot, or wicks, she'asu chachamim, that the rabbis forbade to use those. Yadlik b'hem to, right, for Shabbat. Davar barur hu she'asur l'ishtamesh la'oranu. Look what it says, right? If you did use them, those substances, right, the rabbis did not allow So he says it's very clear that you're not allowed to benefit from their light. Wow. So in other words, even bediavad, if he did it, he still shouldn't use those candles. That's what the Rashba is telling you. Okay, fantastic. So then it says, Ben ner shemadlik ala shulchan, ben kol ner shemadlik bebait. And also, right, doesn't matter whether you're using it in the house or using it on a table. In other words, wherever you use these lights, for Shabbat, you have to follow these rules, these guidelines, regardless of where you put them. Not only one you have on your Shabbat table, but everyone is like that. That's what it says in the Mordechai. Even though it says in the gloss there, it says, Omer Maharam, that Maharam says, Shishama rak shesh b'makom echad near kasher, that he heard, right, that if you have only one place where you have a kosher candle, and by way of this, he's going to remember not to tilt the candle. The other candles in the courtyard, or in the house. So I'm just going to take a minute. I'm going to get something to drink. Just give me a second. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry. So as we said, the Maharam says, "Sheshama rak sheyesh b'makom echad ner kasher de'alideh zeh iskor v'lo yateh shar nerot." So he's trying to make like a chidush over here, right? Like a novel idea, which is that what? If you have one place where you're using a kosher candle, according to the guidelines that we're delineating, so then the rest of them, he says, can be forbidden ones, because he's going to remember by way of that, not to tilt the candle, because that's what we're really worried about here, right? What's the reason why we tell you not to use those substances the wicks, right, which cause the flame to jump around. So the whole thing is that if it's going to jump around, we're afraid, right? He's going to tilt the candle to make it stable. And this is a problem because he's going to cause the candle to ignite by tilting it like that. So this is the reason why we don't want you to use these substances. And this is the reason why the Rashba told you, if you did use it, right, don't use that light, don't benefit from it because you're going to, get into trouble by tilting the candle. So this guy comes and tells you, this rabbi, yeah, but if you have one good one and the other ones are bad, the good one will remind you, not to tilt the candle. That's what he says. Ah. והשר מקוצי אומר דבר שיכול לעשות בלא נר כמו להוציא יין מן החבית. So this rabbi says, right, that something which one is able to do without a candle. For instance, in other words, he doesn't need light so much. Like to remove the wine from the barrel. Mutar l'ishtamesh le'or kol haner. So then you can use any light, he says, even the non-kosher ones. Why is that? Since you don't really need it so much, so then you're not going to come to tilt it. That's the whole thing. Right? But it says the Torah didn't rely on this opinion. He didn't even bring it. That's what it says also, this rabbi. Also there, K, right? So it says, even a candle which you're lighting in the cellar, right, to bring wine out of there, or by way of its light, or becheder, or with in the room, so it says the same rule applies there also as well. You have to use a kosher one, right? So it says all the big rabbis in France wrote like that, not to use it. The Ram also had this custom to do like that. Not like Ravia. So he says you don't really need only the one which you're eating, on the dining room, right, table. That's it. That's only that one has to be kosher. The other ones don't need to be kosher. That's very interesting. Okay, so we do have a machloket here about this. Interesting. Also, this rabbi says, but there are also many rabbis who hold this way, that only the one in the dining room needs to be good, right, on the table, Shabbat table. שכל הנרות שבבית צריכים להיות מדבר שמדליקים בו, right? So he says all the candles of the house have to be, good kosher ones. בראיה, מדמין המפק במה מדליקים. So he says, where's my proof for this? How do I prove it? So it says there in Gemara, כף א' עמוד ב', פתילות ושמנים שאמרו, אין מדליקים בהם בשבת, מדליקים בהם בחנוכה. They said, right, the ones they said you cannot use for Shabbat, but for Hanukkah you can use them. Even if it's Shabbat Hanukkah. The kavta en zakukla, because once it goes out, you don't have to light it again. So we're not concerned, right, that he's gonna, ignite it if it's Hanukkah. The asur ishtamesh the ora. So you're not allowed to. On the other hand, right, you're not allowed to use the light if it's jumping around like that. Alma im haya mutar ishtamesh leora. So it says you see from there that if it was allowed to use its light, haya asur, it would be forbidden. Then you have to use a kosher one. So it says even though the Hanukkah candle they really would put right like on the door, the chutz right outside, and they were not eating there. Okay, good. A little bit more. So Then he continues to explain the Bet Yosef. Perish Rashi she'en madlikin bekanavus, right? And Rashi told us you're not allowed to use canvas either. And also don't use cotton. But Rabbeinu Tam allows cotton, right? So Rashi doesn't allow. Rabbeinu Tam does. That's what it said in Tosfot, right? Like Rabbeinu Tam. So says Bet Yosef, Gam Zesham, right? It's also there. Amatnitin dechol hayotze min ha'etz en madlikin bo. Right? Regarding the Mishnah, which says there that anything which comes out of the wood, tree comes in from the tree, we don't use that to light. Ela pishtan, only right. The only thing we do use is flax. Ran also says this. Oh, so he says, right, the Ran, we can use cotton, right, just like Rabbeinu Tam. What about canvas? He allows that too. So you see, right, that several rabbis argue with Rashi regarding those things that he said. Because he didn't allow canvas, he didn't allow cotton, but these rabbis do. Okay, interesting. Let's move on. The Rosh also says this. Sham Berosh, beginning of the chapter. It says also in the Tshuva of the Geonim, it says like that. Tshuvot Geonim. The Tatu Samag, right? So Samag says this. Be'atruma, Be'Rabbeinu Yerucham, all these rabbis. V'chen katav Rambam, also Rambam. Okay, right? So he seems to go like the Rabbeinu Tam. אינו עושים פתילה אלא מדבר שאינו עוד נדלת בו כגון פשטה נפוצה. Oh, so he says, right, you're not allowed to use, the Rambam gives you a general rule, right? You can only use a wick which, the flame sits on it, nice and straight. But it doesn't jump around, as we said. So he says you can use flax, which is carded out, combed flax. Right. So as we said before, right, if it's not combed, you're not supposed to use flax because it jumps. But once you comb it out, it doesn't jump anymore. That's what we're saying. What's the reason, by the way? Because when you comb it out, it removes the seeds in there. There's seeds. So those seeds cause it to jump. That's the thing. This is the problem. Once you remove them, you're good. So therefore, right, this is, I think, the reason why we use linen wicks, because which are made from flax. Because they're combed out, they're clean, so they don't jump. Okay, fine. So then he says, shesh the what about, right, wool and shesh, right? With shesh is it skips my memory doesn't remember. Shesh, right? Oh, you know what shesh is? Yeah, shesh is linen. Shesh is linen. So he's talking about linen and wool, right? The tzimmer giffen, and also cotton. Things like this. Oh. So Rambam allows these things, right? So let's go over that again. Just make sure we got it straight. The Rambam allows combed flax, right? And also linen, and also cotton. So I think this is what we use, we use this kind of stuff. nowadays. And since they're all like nice and clean, these substances today, they're all cleared out, and pure. So this is the reason why we use them, because they work very well, for wicks. Okay, let's move on. So Rambam says anything similar to that you're allowed to use as well. So he says, now that we see the Rambam, he says, we learn from this that we're not really concerned about what it said in the Agot Maimoniot, right? In the Ram holds like Rashi. And people, that's the custom. So he says the custom is like that, says Bet Yosef, right? That we do use cotton, just like, right, the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. So what do you see from there? We don't paskin like Rashi regarding this halakha, because he was stringent, right, regarding a couple of things, that we're not really stringent about it. What was that? Again, right, cotton and linen, right, or combed flax, right, and what else we had? That's it. Yeah, okay, pretty much that was it. Yeah, okay, those three things. And that's pretty much, as we said, right? That's what we use today, pretty much, these things. Okay, fine. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so let's move on. So the thing is, nowadays we don't make wicks. In the old days, they used to make them at home. That's what they did. So it was like a homemade kind of thing. So you had to know what to make it from. Today we go to the store. We buy them in the store. So we hope that the manufacturer knows what he's doing, right? He knows which substance we're allowed to use. Right? The proof is in the pudding, because actually, they all burn very well, these wicks. So you see, right, that they're using good stuff there. That's what it is, Okay, good. So what else we got? Yeah, we're done. Okay, so let's go to Shulchan Aruch. We got to bring it up. New chapter. Reish Samech Dalid. Okay. All right. Okay. So says Shulchan Aruch like this. And osin petila lener shel Shabbat, right? We don't use the wick, for Shabbat. Ben ner shel shulchan, whether it's on the table, right, your Shabbat table, ben kol ner shel madik b'bayit, or anywhere else in the house. Midabar sha'or eno nechaz bo. So don't use a wick, right, as we said, where the flame doesn't sit well. It's not stable, right? Jumps around. Ela nisach seviva v'asher kofetz kagon semer, right? So he says, which ones are bad? But which culprits do we have here? One is wool, right? Don't use wool. Number one. The se'ar, don't use hair. Things like this, right? Which make the wick, the flame jump. Ela midavar sha'or nitle bo kagon. It says use the good stuff. Like which one? Pishta nefutza, right? Combed flax. Ubeged shesh, right? Or use linen. That's semer giffen, right? Or cotton. Or canvas, right? Canvas. You can use canvas. Not like Rashi, right? Rashi says you can't use canvas. Right? So this pretty much wipes out Rashi. This Shulchan Aruch, right? Whatever he said, we do just the opposite. Right? Okay. So we go like the Rambam, right? Pretty much, more or less. Okay, fine. So says the Rama, Ve'im hidlik badvarim hasuim. So he says, if you use something which is forbidden, even b'diavad, right? What's the story? Asur l'ishtamesh lo. You're not allowed to use that, right? So this is from the Rashba that we saw in the Beit Yosef, coming from there. So we see, right? Even b'diavad, if you use these things, the forbidden stuff, not allowed to get benefit from that light. Why is that? We said, right? The reason is because since it's not stable, we're concerned he's going to tilt it, right, to make it burn better, more stable, whatever, to make it burn brighter. So that's going to be a big, Chilul Shabbat. That's going to be you're breaking Shabbat there by igniting the fire. It's a problem. So you got to watch out. Baruch Hashem, we're fortunate, in the sense that, as we said, right, we buy the wicks in the store, so they're usually, very good. I never had problems with the wicks, usually they're excellent. Okay, great. So some are better than others, I can't tell you. Anyway, then he goes on the Rama, ויש אומרים, דאם יש נר אחד מדברים המותרים, מותר להשתמש לאור האחרים. Oh, so he says, right, he brings that leniency that we saw in the Bet Yosef, which is, if one of them is good, the one on your table, right, your Shabbat table, he says the other ones you can use. It's okay, even if they're not kosher. The other ones in the house, because right, according to this opinion, right, we're not concerned. He's going to tilt it because he doesn't really need them so much. But וכן דבר שאפשר בלא נר. So it seems like we don't pass like this opinion. He brings it like as a yesh omrim. Some say it's not really the halacha. Because in Shulchan Aruch he said just the opposite of this. So he says, then goes on, the Rama continues, וכן דבר שאפשר בלא נר, מותר לעשות אפילו אצל נרות אחרים. Right, so he says also this thing we learned in the Bet Yosef, something which you can do without a candle. You don't really need so much light, So he says then you can use other candles, to do that job. So the example they gave us in Bet Yosef was what? That, to remove the wine from the barrel, right? You don't really need a candle for that. You don't need a strong candle for that. It's like, second nature. When you do things like this, you've done it 1,000 times already. So you don't really need a strong candle, and therefore, right, things like this you can do with a non-kosher candle. So he says, right, that when it comes to the needs of Shabbat, you can be lenient, right? So in other words, he's telling you, the Rama, that you can be lenient, like this opinion, like in a pressing case where you don't have anything else, pretty much, right? You're not really outfitted very well. But since it's a need for Shabbat, he says you can be lenient with like this opinion, But apparently, right, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't go like that. So seems like there's a little bit of a machloket here. Ashkenazim, Sfaradim. Okay, that's pretty much a story. Let's move on. Bet. So says the Tur, Karach davar shemadlikin bo al davar she'en madlikin bo, right? If he wound something that we do light with it around something that we don't light with it. What about that, right? It's like a combination of both. The outside is kosher, the inside is not kosher. Does that work or not? That's the question. 2 layers. אם כיוון להדליק אסור להקפות שרה. So, Rashi explains, right? What does this mean? שלא כרחו סביבו, אלא נתן דבר פסול תחת פתילת שתהא צפה ולא תטבע בשמן. Oh. So Rashi explains like this, interesting. The reason why he wound up, right, one on top of the other, he put the bad stuff, right, under the wick in order that it should float, right, in the oil and not sink inside the oil. So what does that mean? He didn't really wrap it around. He just like put one under the other in order to keep it floating and not sink. So in other words, we have 2 different scenarios here. One is allowed and one is not allowed. If his intention is to light, forbidden. If it was just to harden it, it's allowed. So apparently, right, what he's saying is that if you're using that non-kosher substance just to keep it floating, it's allowed to use it like that, if that's the purpose. But if the purpose is actually that it should burn, right, that non-kosher, then it's not allowed. The rabbis didn't allow that. That's what he's saying. So the Rif explains it differently, not like Rashi, right? He says even if he wound it around, Shara, it's still allowed. That's what the Rosh also says. So he says, what's the reason why? Why does it depend on his intention? This halacha. Because it's only forbidden to do this because we're concerned he's going to use it by itself, without the other substance, the kosher substance. So therefore, when he's doing it, to burn it as a wick, then we're concerned he's going to come to do one because he did the other. I said it the opposite, right? He's going to do the other because he did one. So what does that mean? If he did it to make it right. So when he's using it to burn it, that non-kosher substance, again, right, I'll say it again. If he's using it to burn it, the non-kosher substance, so then we have a problem, because he may come to use that non-kosher substance by itself. But he says, on the other hand, if he's just using it, right, to make it thicker, so then you don't have to worry about that. He's going to do that. He's going to come to do that, to use it by itself. So he says, therefore, you're allowed to also use that non-kosher substance if your intention is to make it, like more erect and straight, like the wick. So it shouldn't sag, down, that will be also allowed. The Rambam also says like that. So it seems like the Rif and the Rambam, right, don't agree with Rashi. Again, right, similar to what we said before. So he says there's another thing, is that some people, what they do is they put like a grain of salt or, right, some kind of legume, pioneer, right, on top of the candle, be'erev Shabbat and Erev Shabbat, kedei sheyeh dolek yafeh b'Shabbat, that it shouldn't burn well on Shabbat. It's like it's a catalyzer, for the flame to burn well. This setup. Interesting. And madlikim ner shel. Okay, that's about it, I guess. Yeah. Okay, gotta go back to Bet Yosef. So regarding this, right, says Bet Yosef. Okay, sorry, I was seeing how long it is. It's a little bit long. We'll see if we can finish it. If not, next time. So anyway, it says here, he brings a source for this. Braita beresh perek lamed madlikim, right? It's a Braita in Lamed madlikim, same place as we saw before in the Gemara. Right? Peresh Rashi says, explains lakpot, right? What does that mean, lakpot? לא היה מדליקו אלא סומך עליו בפתילה להפציפה שלא תטבע. Right, as we said before, Rashi says the reason why he's using that non-kosher substance is just to keep it from sinking into the oil, right? That it should float above. שלא תטבע בשמן ויצף הברזל, right? Like it says in the verse, the book of Kings, right? מתרגמינן וכפה ברזלה. So he proves from here, right, that from this verse, that the word kafa means to float. He's bringing that as a proof for his opinion. Okay, that's very interesting. I will tell you now what the story is with this book, the verse in Book of Kings, but I don't think it's really necessary for us to get into that. Okay, it's an interesting story, but this is not story time. We're here to learn halacha. So, okay, let's move on. If it was the class in the shul, I would say it. To entertain them. They shouldn't fall asleep. Okay. So anyway, right. Let's move on. Aval Arif Piresh, right? As we said, the Rif argues with the Rashi. Leakpot leavot, right? The Rif says it really means to make it thicker, not to make it float. That's not the pshat. Rosh HaPetila, right? To make it thicker, learbot ora, in order to make it, the more of a larger flame, more light. That's how it's written in our texts of the Rif and also in the Ran. So it's according to this, you have to say, when it says, right, to light, it's talking about to light with the non-kosher substance. By itself. According to Ramagid, Perkei, it seems like his text says in the Rif, right, to light, to thicken the wick, in order to give more light. To make it stronger, harder. Rambam also says like that. If you're doing it to thicken the wick, in order to add more light, right? You're not allowed to do that. But if he's doing it to make it harder, that it should stand erect. It shouldn't sag down. Right? Mutar, you're allowed to do that. It's also said there. So he says, right, it's like Rashi, this explanation. So there, he holds the lohaya madlikok the kama Rashi that when he says you wouldn't light that, the Rashi said, I know shelohaya mitkaven, there wasn't his intention. That's what it means. To light it like that. Velo mashma b'divrei rosh shehu mefaresh ken. But he says the Rosh doesn't seem to explain like that. The pshat in the Rif. Sharei achar perush Rashi katav, because after the explanation on Rashi, right, the opinion of Rashi, he writes, the Rif Piresh, he says, the Rif explains the Korech Oto Toch Rosh HaPetila, that he winds it around, right? Inside the top of the wick. In order that it should be thicker. So when you use the language of korech, which means to wrap, so he says it implies like his explanation. But he says nevertheless it's difficult. Why? That will be the same thing as lighting it. Once he wraps it, right, inside the wick, to thicken it. So we can answer, he says that it really depends on your intention, right? Not what you actually did, but what you thought. Since if his intention was just Rosh HaPetila, to thicken the top of the wick, even though we right, light it together, it's all one bundle, right? Mutar, it's allowed. The midi hu tama ela mishum gezerah atu be'enayu. Says because the whole reason why we forbid this is because we decree, right, that he may come to actually use it by itself. But it says since his intention is just to make it harder, right, as we said, so then there's nothing to decree. There's no concern, that he's going to use it by itself. Interesting. Okay, great. But it says, however, even according to Rashi, you can't allow something, right, which is not fitting to light, by itself, to wrap something around that which you can use, kosher one, because you don't really decree here that you're going to come to use it by itself, right? Since by itself it doesn't really work at all. That's what the Ran says. B'Shem Rashba, name of the Rashba. But Rabbeinu Yerucham, this rabbi also wrote like that. Also Mordechai with Truma. But he says regarding, they had a doubt regarding what? Gemi, right? What's Gemi? That's reeds. Are you allowed to use reeds to make a wick out of it? Mashma desvirlu the Gemi chazer b'tila. So implies from this language, right, that we saw that it's allowed to use reeds, by itself. So I guess the reason is because you can't really use it by itself. It's not really usable. So Rashba, right, is sure that it's not really fitting to use by itself. Because he allowed Gemi, right? He allowed to use reeds. Also Samak says like that. But he says when I'm talking about kash, right, which is straw, or this is even the Mordechai says it's definitely allowed. Okay, interesting. So there's a little bit left. Maybe we should finish it. I don't know. Whatever you say. If you have a couple more minutes. So it says like this, right? But it says if his intention was to light it, in other words, to use it as a to light that thing, that forbidden substance is forbidden. So it says this only according to the Rif. But according to Rashi, says it doesn't really depend on your intention. It's actually what you're doing. According to what I proved, he says that the Rosh holds. He holds like the Rashi. If so, he says he shouldn't have written if his intention was like that. Rather, he should have said, right, that if it's coming to light it like that, it's forbidden. Kelashon Braita, like the language of the Braita. Kadesh Yavo Alav Divrei Rashi Ve'arif, in order that it should fit into the language of Rashi and Rif. Ela delot dak, but he says he wasn't precise with his language. V'shema yesh lomar, so perhaps we should say sheno mefaresh divrei Rashi ke'arosh, doesn't explain the way the Rashi like the Rosh does. Ela kemo she'arav Magid. Instead, it explains like Rav Magid. Notrin gargir shel melach, right? And we said, right, that there are some people, as we said, who put grain of salt, right, or some legumes, and to make it burn better. So says Bet Yosef regarding that, Perek Hey, right over there. Katav Rav Magid shehu Tosefta bePerek Bet. He says it comes from Tosefta, Rav Magid. Okay, very interesting. Okay, that's it. So we're done with that. So let's just take a Shulchan Aruch 1 second. It's not too big. Yeah, it's not too big. Okay, so it says like this, right? As we said, right? He wrapped something which is kosher up upon something which is not kosher. So it's a combination of both. Right? So if his intention was to make it thicker, so what does that mean thicker? He wants it to burn brighter, right? More fuel. If that's his intention, then it's forbidden to use that, right? Why is it forbidden to use it? Because we said, right, that the rabbis weren't concerned. If we allow you to use a combination of both, you may come to use it by itself. This is the reason why they forbade. But if his intention is to make it harder, in order that it shouldn't droop down, it should stay straight, nice and straight, vertical, right? That's what we want. So then it's allowed to use it. Why? As we said, right, in the Bet Yosef, the reason why we allow that is because we're not concerned, if that's his intention, we're not concerned that he's gonna come to use it in this case by itself, because he's using it just to harden it, right? He knows that it's not fitting to use by itself. So we're not concerned about that. Okay, that's right. This is the basic halacha regarding this issue, right, of combination of two substances there going on. מטעם זה מותר לכרוך דבר שמדליקים בו על גבי או על גבי גמי. So it says this is the reason why we do allow to wrap, right, something kosher around the reeds, right, or kash, right, or straw. כדי ליתן הפתילה בהששית. In order to put, right, the wick inside the lantern. So what does that mean, right? It means that, as we said, right, these things don't burn. So therefore, right, we're not really concerned that he's going to come to use it by itself, right? So it's the same reason applies here as well. So kash, right? I think it means like stubble, it doesn't really burn so good. I don't know, whatever, it doesn't burn. Something like that. Right? As opposed to hay, which does burn very well. So it's definitely not talking about that. Because the word in Hebrew for hay is teven, right? Okay, whatever. So says Ramah, notrin gargir shel melach begeris shel ful, right? So he says you're allowed to, as we said, right, to put a grain of salt, right, or as we said, right, some kind of a legume, right, a grain, al pi haner, right, on top of the candle, erev Shabbat, kadesh dolik yafeh b'Shabbat, in order that it should burn well, right? So this is allowed to do, right? Nobody does this today, but whatever, right? In those days, I guess it was a popular, right, item there, right? Some kind of popular thing going on there. So today we don't do it. Okay. Yeah, because our wicks, they burn very well, as I said, right? So we don't really have a problem today with these things. Okay, fantastic. So I guess we'll stop here. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak u'baruch, laila tov, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless.